So welcome, 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 our brilliant and beloved colleague, Cathy. We so appreciate your consistent visionary leadership and solidarity. And as always at Setsi, we begin all things by giving thanks to the original stewards of the various lands we're on. We give thanks to all our ancestors, all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We give thanks to all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. So, Cathy, can you please introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers and share a bit about your remarkable work?
Well, thanks very much, Victor. My name is Cathy Barr, and I am currently Vice President, Research and Strategic Relationships at Imagine Canada. And I have been in Imagine Canada for almost 22 years now. So I've held several different roles over that period of time. But the consistent piece has been in the research area throughout that. That's where I started originally as Director of Research between 2002 and 2007. And then I took a little detour and did some things relating to insurance and risk management. And then I did a fair amount of work, a fairly long detour into our ethical fundraising and financial accountability code, and was involved in the creation of our standards program for charities and nonprofits. That took quite a bit of my time, around 2009 to 13 period. And then kind of coming back to more of a focus on research and adding in some work on public policy and advocacy as well in the last few years. So it's been a very rewarding career.
Oh, what a journey. And I was so excited to, one, connect with you for this interview before you retire. But even though I know we'll still be working long after, I'm just so excited to be able to dive into your work and your impact, because it's been truly remarkable working with you over the past few years. So my next question is, what's inspiring you right now? What has you curious, or what's keeping you up at nights?
Well, it's actually the same thing. The last few years, and I would say the last 4 years since the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is slightly more than 4 years ago now, my passion and which is both exciting and also does occasionally keep me up at night, is around improving the data ecosystem for the nonprofit sector. So this is kind of a culmination, I guess, of work I've been doing for a number of years, but it's really focused in the last 4 years on the desperate need for more data and better quality data, and more knowledge and data mobilization in the sector, so that we have the data and information we need to make better decisions. And this is something I've been aware of for a very long time. When I first came to, in fact, it was Canadian Centre for Philanthropy I started with, not Imagine Canada, because I was there before Imagine Canada became an entity. So our focus back then was on a large number of large-scale projects. One being the National Survey of Nonprofit and Voluntary Organizations, which was the first survey of its kind to look at the whole charitable and nonprofit sector in a survey format. And it was a survey of about 13,000 organizations, so it was very large. And at that time, we had the hope, and really actually the expectation, that that was going to become a regular data point, that we were going to every 3 to 5 years have a survey of the sector. That was the plan. The plan went off the rails when government changed, and we spent a very long time without not only not having that data, but without much hope really of getting that data. Just recently, Statistics Canada did the first survey of the charitable nonprofit sector that has done since 2003. And it wasn't as large a scale. It was done as a special module of the Canadian Survey of Business Conditions. But it was the first glimpse we've got. And in between that, of course, so many things happened. We had the economic downturn of 2007, 2008. That was when Imagine Canada started doing its own surveys, the sector monitor surveys, to make up for the fact that we had no idea. We knew anecdotally that charities were being severely impacted by the economic downturn, but we didn't have numbers. And when we were going to advocate to government they wanted to know, well, what's going on? How many are impacted? In what way? And so we needed to collect that data. So we started our sector monitor surveys. Then a few years after that, the pandemic hit. And again, governments are like, well, what's going on? What do you need? And we immediately fielded a sector monitor survey. But as the pandemic went on, we realized like the sector itself does not have the resources to, and certainly Imagine Canada doesn't have the resources to collect the kind of data we really need. We need good quality, real-time data on how many organizations there are, what they're doing, where they're located, who they're serving. During the pandemic, in the early days, government was calling us saying, how many organizations serving Black Canadians are in Toronto? And we said, we don't know. Nobody knows. How many organizations serving women are in Alberta? We don't know. Nobody knows, right? We have good data on registered charities, but almost none on nonprofits that are not registered charities, which is probably slightly more than half the sector. So it was just so glaringly obvious during the early days of the pandemic, and it just brought home to me how important this is. And so I kind of decided to dedicate the last few years of my full-time work at Imagine Canada, at least, to this issue. And since then I've been working on it really intensively. And it's exciting because there seems to be movement in progress. It still keeps me up at night because there's still so much work to be done. And the moment there's any sign of fiscal restraint in Ottawa, any slight progress we've made, there's backtracking, because the heart of the problem in terms of why the federal government does not collect data about our sector is that the Statistics Canada is not mandated to do so. They are required by law to collect all kinds of incredibly detailed information about the agricultural sector and the manufacturing sector and virtually every other sector you can think of. They are legally required to collect data on. They are not legally required to collect data on our sector. So the moment there's even the slightest cutbacks, we are the ones who get cut. And so we make a little progress and then we lose it. We make a little, then we lose it. And sometimes we lose it for a very long time. And so this is why it's so important, and it shouldn't be up to the sector to collect this data. Frequently, we hear, not so much recently, but when we first started talking about this, well, you should collect your own data. It's like, no, we shouldn't. You collect the data about every other part of this, the Canadian economy. You can collect data about the nonprofit sector as well. We are part of the Canadian economy. We contribute about 8.5% of the gross domestic product annually, and it hasn't changed very much in the last many years since we've had that number. There is about 2.8 million, 2.5, 2.8 million staff. We are an important part of the Canadian economy, and we provide care and services and all the things that are the social infrastructure on which everything else rests. And again, that was very obvious during the pandemic. When there was no childcare, people couldn't work. When there was no, particularly women couldn't work. And when, things were going poorly in homes for the aged, the military had to step in. We need data on this. Should be the government's job to collect that data.
Couldn't agree more, and that's so frustrating. My goodness, I know that's I know this information anecdotally, but that journey and that narrative of just momentum rising and then waning, why rising and waning, is frustrating us around a sector that is already vulnerable in this thing. So once again, I appreciate your leadership and tenacity in this space, and it's a perfect segue to my next question. What challenges and barriers you and your colleagues face, and what are some of the approaches you're taking to overcome some of these challenges and barriers?
Yeah, that's a great question. The biggest challenge, I think, is a perception challenge, which in the short term is the perceptions within the federal government about the sector, what the sector is, who we are, what we do. But underlying that is the perception that exists everywhere in the general population. Public servants and politicians are just people, and they know more about some things, but for a lot of things, their perceptions and ideas tend to be very similar to the general public. And when it comes to the charitable and nonprofit sector, that tends to be, kind of generally good feelings that we're good people doing good things. And we're kind of always there, and we're there when you need us. And sometimes we're asking for money. Mostly we're asking for money. That seems to be the default, that when we're asking for things, we're asking for money. Like, I've had the experience of going in and meeting with various groups of political leaders and officials, and there's often, they think you're there to ask for money, even when you're not, and they want to tell you about their grant program, and it's like, I'm not here to talk to you about your grant program. I'm here to talk to you about the data that the government collects about the nonprofit sector, for example. And so there's this, and they think about, like most Canadians, they think about the sector very occasionally, and in a very, the other thing, in a very atomized way. So maybe they'll, if they're involved with, their children are involved with sports, they may think about, oh yeah, all those great volunteers that run the sports programs. If they maybe if their mother is in a nonprofit care home, they maybe think of that, but they may think about it more as government. A lot of Canadians and government officials, they think of hospitals, universities, colleges, long-term care homes, they think of them more as government. They don't really think of them as charities and nonprofits, even though they all are, and they should know it, because they certainly all ask for donations, just like charities, other charities. And so there's just this general view that we're a lot of good people doing good things, but we're not important like the business sector. And personally, I think there is a lot of unconscious, I'm going to be kind and say it's unconscious bias against the sector, or in relation to the sector, because of who we are and what we do. Our sector is a predominantly female sector, right? More than 3/4 of the staff in nonprofits and charities are women. It's not equally distributed across all parts of the sector, but that's the overall number. An enormous percentage are racialized people, and immigrants, far higher than the percentage of racialized people and immigrants in the population. So we are a female-dominated, racialized, immigrant-heavy sector. We are a sector that does a lot of things that have always been done by women, racial and racialized people and immigrants, for low pay, or ideally maybe no pay, right? As far, so care work that women and racialized people have always done, either for free or at very low rates of pay. And that view dominates the view of the sector in the public and in government. And so, we get people saying things like, lately we've been advocating in relation to the upcoming federal budget. We do that every year. But this year, in one meeting, we were told, we've done a lot for the charitable sector. We've had things in, like, the last 2 budgets for the charitable sector. And we were like, can you imagine them saying, we had things in last budget for small business. What more do you people want? Which is kind of the feeling you get with charities. I once had somebody in the Treasury Board say something about, well, we don't collect data. We collect data on all those industries because they contribute to the economy. We don't collect data on nonprofits because you don't pay taxes. And I'm like, well, I guess we don't pay income taxes, but we certainly contribute to the Canadian economy, and we pay all kinds of other taxes. And it's that view that dominates everywhere. And I think more than anything, that's the view that hinders progress, because we're seen as just we're not as important to pay attention to as a sector. Certain parts of it, at times, government's paying a lot of attention right now to housing. Like, certain parts of it get attention at certain times, but the sector as a whole, we're just not seen as a sector as a whole either. That's another challenge. We're seen as a little parts of it. And different parts of it deal with different departments, which is another issue, which is why Imagine Canada for a long time has been advocating for a homing government in the federal government, to have somewhere where some group of people in government that view the nonprofit sector as the nonprofit sector, not as housing or settlement services or international relief or all these different things, but as charities and nonprofits. And that's why we think home and government is important. It's that because it would create that group of people who have that knowledge and understanding that could bring it to other parts of the sector.
That's incredible. Thank you so much for all that context and background. A lot of times when folks talk about this sector, they don't see the growth, the scale, the innovation, or the essential services in the sector. And I think COVID created a dynamic where everyone saw not just the increase in demand, but the fact that, as you mentioned, there isn't equity or even sustainability in terms of how the sector is engaged by various really important public institutions and all three levels of government. So once again, I just appreciate your candor and transparency and the advocacy work and leadership that you and your colleagues have been facilitating. So my second last question, what is your ultimate goal? What does success look like and feel like to you and your colleagues?
Well, overall, Imagine Canada's goal in relation to our advocacy is really to ensure that the social sector, charities and nonprofits, the social sector, community sector, whatever you want to call it, is taken into consideration in a very basic way whenever policy is being made, whenever decisions are being taken, whenever legislation is being introduced. That's our ultimate goal. So, and that we are part of the or considerations of our sector are part of the decision-making framework of the federal government, just as they do a gender-based plus analysis. They look at legislation and policy proposals through the lens of how will it affect small business. We want them to be looking at through the lens of how does it affect charities and nonprofits. And so that's the overall goal for public policy at Imagine Canada. My more personal goal in terms of the data file, and it's been changing over time. I think right now my advocacy goal would be to have a unit in Statistics Canada that is responsible for the nonprofit sector. And it's almost like a home and government, but within Statistics Canada, because I'm seeing the same thing in my conversations with Statistics Canada that we see overall in the government. And that is that it's very atomized what different sections of Statistics Canada are doing different things that relate to the nonprofit sector, but they're not always talking to each other. In fact, they're often not talking to each other. And so what one group of people is doing isn't necessarily relating to or connected to what another group of people is doing. So we're not getting as big a bang for our buck as we could, or they're not really getting as big bang for their buck as they could if they were more integrated. And I think again, they have sections within Statistics Canada that are focused on other industries. And so I think I'm starting to think, and this is newer thinking on my part, that is an important goal to have that place in Statistics Canada, because it helps them build up subject matter knowledge. They can comment on other things. They can make sure that nonprofits are included in various surveys. I recently discovered by accident, for example, that nonprofits are included in the Canadian Survey of Cybersecurity and Cybercrime. But the data for nonprofits has not been broken out. And I actually discovered the existence of this survey by accident when I was looking for something else, but latched onto it. And because I know people at Statistics Canada, I emailed them and said, hey, are nonprofits included in this survey? And oh, well, I'll connect you to the right person, because, that's how government works. And I got talking to the right person, and they're like, well, we do include them. I'm like, well, could you break out the data? Could you make the data public for nonprofits? Yeah, we could do that. We were kind of just waiting for somebody to ask us, So I think if we had a home in Statistics Canada for the nonprofits, more of that could be happening. And ideally, I'd like to see nonprofits included by default in all business surveys. unless there was some really clear reason why they should be excluded, as opposed to now it seems you have to make a clear reason why they should be included. Like, of course, nonprofits are interested in cybersecurity and cybercrime. Like, and in fact, they are included in the survey, but the data wasn't broken out for them. So we don't know, like, how valuable would that for our joint work on the Canadian Centre for Nonprofit Digital Resilience, right? Like it's, and the survey's already been done. It's high quality, big sample size, far better than we could do for ourselves in the sector. And then we can focus our sector resources on other things. So those are kind of my big goals. I'd also, and you've heard me talk about this before, Victor, I'm also very interested in establishing a nonprofit data lab or data center, use various names for it, that would be some sort of collaborative between the sector and government, that would become a home for the advocacy in relation to data and our sector, as a place where researchers and data analysts could go for help and information on their tasks, and even just to create a kind of community of practice, because most nonprofits have data analysts or researchers. If they have one at all, they've got like one, and so they never get to connect with each other. So to build a place for that, build a place to make data, clean, usable data available to other researchers. That's another, so I guess those are my three big things I'd like to see happen.
That's incredible. Thank you so much once again for your candor and your leadership. And that's frustrating once again. Like, the collection of high quality disaggregated demographic data is already hard. And it's hard for sectors, but the fact that this data already exists and it just needs to be disseminated in a way that makes sense for the sector, once again, speaks to just the right hand not knowing what the left hand's doing. So there needs to be more consolidation of resources and more leadership and diligence. So once again, I applaud your leadership and the relationships that you've built, because relational infrastructure is also data. So the fact that you're able to make those calls and build those relationships, that doesn't come easy as well. So once again, I applaud you. So my last question, do you have any closing thoughts or calls to action for our listeners and our viewers?
Get involved with advocacy if you can. I know not everyone can, and I know many organizations are very focused on what's right in front of them and the needs. But I think it's at the level of advocacy that things really change, which is why I've been focused on this data file for the last few years. I can do research projects, and maybe when I retire, I'll do some research projects. But I think the advocacy work is where I see the real change happening. Like, rather than, expend more philanthropic resources, collecting more data and doing more research, that's important, obviously, but I think the bigger win would be to get the machinery of government working more effectively for the sector, both in terms of the data file specifically and other issues for the sector more generally. And so get involved. Get involved with Imagine Canada. It's a great organization. I've worked there for 22 years. Become a member. We have free membership now for small organizations. So
that is a fact.
Yeah.
ImagineCanada.ca for all our listeners and viewers. Bruce has been doing some incredible work, and Cathy, we're still trying to get Cathy to not retire. So we'll see how that plays out. But a truly incredible.
Oh, I may still do a few little things here and there.
I'm hoping so. And once again, Cathy, I just always applaud your leadership, tenacity, resilience, self-determination, and your visionary, consistent leadership and solidarity. You've always been a colleague that we can call on and support and engage, and just your thought leadership has been incredible. But also the fact that you're a practitioner in the space and you make things easier for those coming behind you. So once again, I just applaud all that you do for so many. And as always, at Setsi, we close the way we began this conversation by giving thanks and acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we're on. We give thanks to all our ancestors, all those who toiled, without compassion or compensation. We give thanks to all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. Thank you so much, Cathy. We appreciate you, fam.
Thank you very much, Victor.